Hi, this is Dr. Bridget Drafahl. I am the chair of the DNP and Healthcare Programs, and we're going to cover the literature review that will be required for your DNP project. One of the most common questions that the students always ask is, how long should my literature review be? How many articles do I need? How many pages does it have to be? This is a really tough question, but I want you to consider three things. First of all, the saturation of information. I think we could probably all spend hours and hours on the library looking for literature that actually is pertinent, or that one perfect article that you want for your lit review. It's important that you find all the perfect articles for your lit review. So until you start seeing articles that are repeating or saturation of the information, as we call it, that's when you can stop looking for articles. I'm not sure if that ever happens, but I will tell you that when you start to see the same thing over and over, you don't need 10 articles that say the same thing, do you? But you can have 2 or 3 that have the same type of research and support what it is that you want to say, because the more you have, the more credible that particular piece of information will be in your written work. So how do you determine the length then? Again, it just really depends on what it is that you want to cover in your literature review. Now, when we talk about the pieces of your literature review, you want to make sure you cover all the concepts that you have identified. So in your PICO question, we talked about population, and we're going to have a section for the population and the sample size. But if your population is talking about associate degree nurses, then you want to identify those. So you're going to have some concepts that are unique to each one of your projects. You may not all have to describe or identify what you consider the nursing student in your project. You may want to talk about simulation. So maybe your project is on simulation, and you might want to describe, first of all, the history of simulation. And then, of course, you'll want to go into what type of simulation. Are you using high fidelity simulation or low fidelity, and all the different parts to it? Are you going to talk about debriefing? So you can see that there are many concepts that need to be examined. And even if you have found all these articles and that they're really good support for your project, it doesn't necessarily always mean that that's it, that you have 6 articles and out of this I can get about 3 pages. No, because it depends on the concepts that need to be explained in your paper. As a reader, I have to understand and I have to know, when you're talking about nursing students, what are you talking about? Because my description of a nursing student is different from yours. And also my description of high fidelity could be completely different from yours. So make sure that you explain your concepts to the reader. And then, of course, what concepts should I include? Well, we kind of already talked about that a little bit, but those concepts that need explaining, and I don't mean just defining, because we do have a definition section of your project too, which is in section 1. So we want to make sure that your concepts that you're talking about are pertinent to your project. So again, if I'm talking about nursing students, what kind of nursing students, and why is it important? If I'm talking about simulation in the ADN student, and I want to talk about how it's important in the last semester of an ADN program, why? Why have I chosen that last semester? You need to explain that to your reader so it's very clear. So before we start talking about the different parts of the literature review, I just want to quickly run through the headings that are APA formatted. So a level 1 heading would be those type of broad overview topics. So let's go back to our simulation discussion, which I'm going to use throughout this voice thread to talk about a literature review. If I'm going to talk about simulation probably will be my level 1 heading, which means it's centered, bold-faced, uppercase and lowercase letters. Then underneath simulation, a second level maybe high fidelity simulation. Then that becomes left aligned, boldface, upper and lowercase letters. Underneath high fidelity simulation, I may want to talk about specific mannequins, the Laerdal, the Annie, the whatever it is, and that would become a level 3 then. So it would be indented, boldface, lowercase heading with a period. Most of the time, this is about as far as students will go, but you may have a level 4 heading. So if I were going to talk specifically about a particular mannequin, that would be my level 3 heading underneath simulation. But I also might want to talk about those mannequins that are low fidelity. Now, I could start that as a new level 2 heading, or it could go underneath with level 4, which would be indented, bold-faced, italicized, lowercase heading with the period, and etc. Okay. Another thing to consider is when you're talking about topics, make sure that you organize and you organize and you organize some more. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. This will really help for you to avoid jumping around between topics, which only confuses the reader. And it doesn't help you as well, because then you become your thinking becomes a little disorganized, and you tendency then to just jump from subject to subject and back and forth. And imagine you're reading a children's story and they're talking about animals, and then pretty soon they're talking about the zookeeper, and then they go back to the animals. It becomes just very hard to follow, and what happens is people will stop reading it. It's not a professionally written article, and it doesn't necessarily capture and hold people's attention. And then you're going to want to summarize at the end of each major heading. Major meaning level 1 headings. So I'm going to talk about simulation, I'm going to talk about high fidelity, and then I'm going to talk about specific mannequins. And before I go to my next level 1 heading, I'm probably going to give a summary of all of that. Summaries are a paragraph, and remember, paragraphs are not 1 sentence. They're not 2 sentences. They need to be 3 or more sentences. Okay, so summarize at the end of each one. All right, let's spend a minute talking about citing. This is pretty standard APA, and I know many of you probably just came from your MSN program or your master's program somewhere, and this is probably nothing new for you, and that's just fine. But there are also several of you who have been out of school for quite some time, and so let's talk just a minute about different ways to cite your authors. The one thing to always keep in mind in your literature review is anytime you are discussing prior research, so someone else's work, it always has to be presented in the past tense, even when you're currently writing it. So it's not unusual to have both past and present tense in one paragraph, because you may talk about the author's work, the researcher's work from previous research, and then apply it to the present project that you're working on. So it's always going to be in third person. How do you make it third person? It's so easy with a typical author's name, isn't it? You can say Smith and then the year, looked at, or in 2014, if you want to use the date in your sentence, Smith looked at. Now, the other thing to remember is that you want to avoid passive voice. So Smith is or was is passive, right? Because you can't was anything. So Smith looked, Smith described, Smith hypothesized, Smith did something in an active voice. It's so hard because we write and we speak in passive voice probably a large majority of our day when we're talking to other people. We don't actively say. So it's something you have to train your brain to look for in your literature review. So always be looking for, how can I make that is into an active verb so that it's active voice. And one of the things that I would really recommend is that you get a thesaurus, use your thesaurus in your Word document, whatever it is, but use it regularly. Every time you have a word in there, instead of using all the time described, look for something else. Look in your thesaurus, look up your synonyms, look for things that you can replace that word with. It's always a work in progress. Even up until the day you submit your final project, you will be seeing is or was as those words pop out at you eventually, and you'll be looking to change them. So now it's a good time just to get in the habit of trying to write in that active voice. So always in the past tense, so you can see that the author looked at past tense. The other thing is that you want to make sure that the author can actually do it. So if you're talking about Smith demonstrated, that's fine, but Smith's research demonstrated does not happen, right? The research cannot demonstrate anything. So the research posited maybe, or something that is an active voice, but Smith's research cannot demonstrate anything. So keep that in mind too. Or in citing, you can put your author and date at the end of the information from that source. So you may have several different authors and sources at the end of your paragraph, and a good writer will not end with a source. So at the end of a paragraph, you want to then at least have one sentence that is your own information. Otherwise, you synthesize the entire paragraph and then put in your thoughts at the end. Again, not in first person though, you're still going to keep it in third person. It's really hard to transition to that third person as well. And I say just take out the feelings or emotions behind it and make it very objective and cold, because that's kind of what professional writing is, isn't it? It's very kind of non-emotional. So it just becomes the research instead of my research, right? So those are some key things about citing. Okay, now to prepare for where our content goes, we've talked about what content needs to be included, how we organize our headings, and also how to cite within each one of those sections. The next part is where do I put my content? How do I organize it? So I can't say it enough. Organize, organize, organize. Do not sit down at your computer with all of your articles in front of you and think you're just going to put all the pieces together. That's when your literature research section is going to become very discombobulated and jump around from topic to topic. Develop a plan first. Create an outline if you need to. Start with annotated bibs if you want to. Think about historically, then move to current practice for each content item. And we'll talk more about that later. So if you are one of those people that have a tendency to read an article and then rewrite it just like the author did, I would suggest you put together an annotated bib. The annotated bib will just be, your APA reference and then a paragraph about what that article is about. And what I did when I was working on mine was I would put the APA reference at the top and I would just put bullet points, not full sentences. That prevented me from plagiarizing, and I could paraphrase much easier. And I would say, Smith noted or Smith looked at, and I would look at each one of those and I would group them. I'm very much a visual learner, and so I would group them next to my computer by the concepts. If I was going to talk about the concepts of critical thinking, then I had all of those laid out by my computer, and I knew I had to formulate my critical thinking section with these articles, and then I'd move on to the next one. Whatever it is, you've got to first start with an outline. Where will each one of those articles go? How will it flow? What level headings are you going to use? Some people even start their literature review by putting in the level headings. And so, on your paper, you can put simulation and then the level 2 heading, high fidelity, and then, maybe another level 2 with low fidelity. So it kind of helps them organize their thoughts. And then when they start writing, they know, okay, this section I'm only going to write about high fidelity. Later on, I'm going to talk about low fidelity, but right here, it's just high fidelity, and I need to stick with that. And then use your articles to support what you're saying. That's the key to your lit review, is the articles need to support that content area. So you shouldn't be talking about simulation or have the heading of simulation and then have articles that pertain to the history of high fidelity. That's going to go lower underneath your high fidelity part, right? You can have history of simulation and then the current practice, but try to keep it really well organized that way. Some of the basics of your lit review before we move on to comparing and contrasting is your lit review needs to be at least 7 pages in length. Okay, and we already talked about how it needs to include everything until you have reached saturation of your material or your data. Your chair will most likely ask you to expand on this section, so 7 pages is probably just a start while you're in N740 or in your residency class. You're going to just kind of touch the surface with 7 pages probably. By the time you're done with it and submit it finally, it may be upwards of 15 to 20 pages. So just know this is just a beginning at 7 pages. We're going to start with a little bit of an intro in your lit review. So what kind of keywords did you use for your research? What databases did you use? And then, of course, limiters to search for. That should only take about 1 paragraph at the beginning of your lit review. And then you're going to have a very small area, and I can't express enough, a small area on theoretical framework. So identify your theoretical framework, explain why you chose it, but later on we're going to tie it into the concepts. So just a small, again, probably 2 to 3 paragraphs on the theoretical framework for your paper. And then comes the meat of your literature review. This is the synthesis of your material. So we're going to talk about comparing and contrasting of articles next. The writing section of your literature review will be primarily filled with comparing and contrasting of articles that you have found. So again, you want to make sure you have saturation of that information, because if you hand me a literature review that has 7 articles and you've tried to get 7 pages by just comparing and contrasting 7 articles, it's not going to be a lot of information in there, is it? It's going to be a lot of repetitive information, and you probably will need to revise it. So this part is not intended to be a summary. You do not summarize each article and then move on to the next one. It's also not an annotated bib of each article. So I know we talked about annotated bib earlier, and it was just an example to help you get organized in how your paper flows and without plagiarizing. So helping you to paraphrase articles and not plagiarize them. So you want to start off with your PICO. You're going to talk about your population. You're going to talk about the historical and then contemporary articles in regards to your population. Remember when I said you want to talk about nursing students? Your interpretation or definition of nursing students is different than mine, and of course my past experience with nursing students. So in your paper, you need to tell me, I've chosen associate degree nursing students, and this article says this is the best one. This article says it also is a good one. However, this article said it may or may not be the best one. That's a good compare and contrast of your population. And then, of course, we go into your intervention, your comparison, in your outcomes, and then of course timeline if it's pertinent. And each one of those is going to contain historical and contemporary literature. So this is a lot of literature, isn't it? You need to look up literature historically and contemporary of each piece of your PICO. Now, you're not going to write it like that. I don't want to see P or population as a level 1 heading, but it helps you to organize your literature review if you go in that order, because that's how our brains are looking for it. In a professional paper, we're looking about who you're doing, who the population is, the who of your project, then what are you doing, then I want to see the comparison, and then of course the why and the outcomes. So all of that kind of flows together. So again, each one of those historical and contemporary articles, comparing and contrasting. In the literature review summary, then, at the end of the literature review, you're going to identify themes, strengths, weaknesses, and gaps in your literature review. So this may take a page, 2 pages, 3 pages. You're going to give me a summary, and you're going to say that, all of these articles, and you may list all the authors, themes, common themes identified in all of these authors' articles was, okay, there's passive again, so don't use was, but you want to make sure that you are thinking about all the themes from all of your articles. And then the strengths, and then the weaknesses and gaps. This is really where we see the synthesis of all of your information is in the gaps. If you can say to me, in the literature, there is a gap in knowledge about how students debrief after high fidelity simulation. That tells me you've taken all this literature together, you've done a really good job of synthesizing it in your brain, and you've come to the conclusion, hey, there's a gap in this, and this is why I need to do this project. Okay? Remember, data and citations only strengthen your review. Do not, and this is really key in your literature review, do not attempt to write this based on your own experience. The literature review needs many, many, many data points and citations. The only place we want to see your synthesis or your interpretation is perhaps the last, sentence in a paragraph where you've compared and contrasted a couple of articles, or also in the literature review summary where I just talked about you're identifying themes, strengths, weaknesses, and gaps. Okay, here's the meat of your literature review, the compare and contrast sections. Choose your content that you want to compare and contrast. Begin with that historical research. You may want to bring in some editorial pieces, but remember, they don't necessarily strengthen your credibility in this section. It may just be from, unless you have somebody like, Patricia Benner, and who's an expert, subject matter expert on the novice to expert transition, then okay, that's okay to bring in some editorial pieces, but it should not be the bulk of what your literature is about, okay? Then you're going to cite the current literature. When you use sources cited, you have to cite those sources, or it's just your word, and it's really not as credible. That's probably one of the biggest mistakes I see students make. They say, sources cited, and then they give a bunch of information. Well, what's the sources? Who's the source? I need to know that, because it gives that credibility, and also tells me that you have done the research, and you could actually have 3 or 4 different articles and all the authors right in that one sentence, or put it at the end. If there's 3 or 4 articles that say the same thing, then put it at the end, but make sure you have in-text citation in that particular situation. Okay? Compare and contrast various viewpoints. It's okay to play the devil's advocate. So you're going to look at ADN students in their last semester, but also, what about the article by Jones that says Well, those students in the last semester may not be the best to try out new things on. That's great. Tell me the other side of the story. Otherwise, I think you're just trying to pull the wool over my eyes, right? And you're trying to convince me that this is the best way to do it. So make sure you use both sides of it, and then at the end come in with a strong, these are the themes, this is what I see, this is why I'm going to do this project. Okay? Summarize the content, which we've talked about, and then begin a next section. So each one of your content areas should be set up the same way. Historical, bring in the current literature, maybe some editorial pieces, compare and contrast in that content, summarize, move on to the next content area. We are going to end with a couple of examples of comparing and contrasting so you can see the difference. So this section talks about one article, compares or contrasts with another article or even author, and then you can cite many authors, giving your paper credibility, or that section or that content. So you can see it talks about the NLN, the National League of Nursing, and the American Nurses Credentialing Center declared critical thinking a core competency for graduates of an accredited institution. Look at all of the different sources in that paragraph. The ability to be a good critical thinker upon graduation has never been a debate in the nursing profession. What has been debated is the definition of critical thinking, ways to cultivate critical thinking in nursing students, types of activities that would encourage critical thinking, improving educators' critical thinking skills, and the type of work environment that may inhibit or develop critical thinking in nurse educators, ending with 1, 2, 3 sources that support that whole sentence. So those are things that are really important that you show and demonstrate. First of all, I talked about good critical thinking, or they did, and then we ended up with, but what has been debated. So look at the difference, comparing and contrasting. And I did not, or whoever wrote this article, did not write all of this using one source. It did not have a summary and at the end have one source. That's not what the literature review should look like. And the last example we have is where we have used several within the paragraph. So critical thinking concepts and discussion in the field of nursing education first appeared in articles in the 1980s. Since that time, nurse educators have researched, analyzed, and implemented strategies to promote critical thinking through the use of creativity. The interest and necessity to continue to explore this concept will not be waning anytime soon. The National League of Nurses and the American Association of Colleges of Nursing have also realized the importance of critical thinking by mandating the concept be incorporated into a nursing curriculum to achieve accreditation. Critical thinking has become an obsession that drives nurse educators to implement creative strategies that lead to successful outcomes. So you can see in there, I've compared many articles in there. So we actually have, let's see what they have, 1, 2, 3, 3 articles supporting each other. So I've grouped them all together. Again, there is not a paragraph and then at the end, all of the sources. You have to use them all in your paragraph to support each other, not just at the end of the paragraph. So if you have any questions about the literature review, please reach out to your chair, to your course instructor, to your faculty, whoever it is that you feel comfortable, and ask questions. Thank you.